Hi, and welcome to LOA Live. I'm Max Rudin, president and publisher of Library of America, a nonprofit organization dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the multivocal democratic spirit of our literary tradition a vital part of the culture. Warm thanks to LOA members and to all of you here tonight for supporting our work and these LOA Live programs. Octavia E. Butler, whose stunningly original and eerily prophetic speculative fiction now seems indispensable, would have turned 78 this year. Her visionary novels and stories transformed the genre and opened new possibilities for American writing. Library of America has just published the second volume in its Octavia Butler edition, Lilith's Brood, the Xenogenesis Trilogy, volume number 393 in the series. A wildly imaginative saga of interspecies contact, genetic transformation, and human survival. It stages and explores uncannily familiar feeling situations involving technology, sex, and the asymmetries of power, and the porous boundaries of gender, race, and even species identity. It is edited by Imani Perry, and we're extraordinarily fortunate to have her here tonight in conversation with celebrated writer and friend of Octavia Butler, Tananarive Due. And our producers will drop a link to the book in the chat. Imani Perry is Henry A. Morse Jr. and Elizabeth W. Morse Professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality, and of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. Her 9 books include the National Book Award winning South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation, and most recently, Black in Blues, How a Color Tells the Story of My People. She joins us from Philadelphia. Tananarive Due has been a leading voice in speculative fiction for more than 20 years. Her acclaimed novels and stories include most recently the novel The Reformatory, winner of the American Book Award, the Shirley Jackson, Bram Stoker, and World Fantasy Awards, and the LA Times Book Prize. With her mother, civil rights activist Patricia Stevens Due, she wrote Freedom in the Family, a mother-daughter memoir of the fight for civil rights. She's also a film historian with expertise in the Black horror genre, and she joins us from Southern California, where she teaches at UCLA. We welcome your questions and comments and invite you to share your name and where you're viewing from. The Q&A button is on your menu bar. Now, please welcome Imani Perry.
Good evening, everyone. I am so delighted to be in conversation with you all. Although I can't see everyone who's here, I can feel the energy. And I just wanted to start a bit by talking about my relationship to this volume before bringing on Tananarive Due. I am known primarily as a scholar of history, literature, cultural studies, and also as a writer of creative nonfiction. And so I think it might seem surprising for me to undertake this particular task. But my relationship to Octavia Butler began when I was very young. I was a voracious reader as a child. And my mother received a letter from the New Orleans poet Quo Vadis Jex Bro, who recommended to her that she get me Octavia Butler's work. And so the Lilith's Brood Xenogenesis series really became part of my coming of age. I devoured her work through my childhood. And over the course of this multi-decade relationship with her work, I developed a sense of both the importance of Black women being in the speculative literary tradition, but also what grew for me, particularly as I became a student and scholar of the literary tradition is that there's a deep connection between the speculative tradition and Black culture more broadly in other arenas, from conjure to hoodoo, to the creation of completely new forms of music and art, because at the heart of all of it is the use of the imagination in the service of a deeper understanding of humanity as we try to navigate a quite difficult world. In recent years, so many of us have turned to Parable of the Sower, and to a little bit lesser extent, Parable of the Talents, among Octavia Butler's extraordinary body of writing, in part because of this remarkable prescience of those works. They are eerily prophetic, as was already stated, but also because they reveal Octavia Butler's ability to read our world so well, even now after she's crossed over to the other side. We've also found ourselves turning to the beautiful journals that she left, and reading her reflections on her own life as this important model of someone who believed in herself and built herself as a literary artist who would break barriers and change the world, indeed, with her work, from what many, if not most, would see as an unlikely place, as a Black woman from Pasadena, who faced dyslexia, who was deeply shy, and yet saw a vision of her future. And so she has a very present kind of heroic space in our lives right now. And we're accessing that largely through these three particular texts and documents. But this collection, from an earlier period in her literary life than the Parable volumes, I think is really important to turn to now. And I hope more people will turn to them and read them, both because they're beautiful works, but also because they help us understand our present moment. They deal with the clear and present danger of human destructiveness, of surveillance technologies, of lives in which we are effectively hybrid creatures. We're cyborgs, we're living with genetic modification and genetic engineering. And in the midst of all that, we have to struggle around to what extent we are actually consenting to all of the changes that are happening in our lives and with the terms of our very survival. And so this collection speaks to all of that. It begins by following the life of Lilith who has the name of a woman who in Jewish mysticism was Adam's first wife. And this is an indication in a sense of who she is in the series, the mother of a new era of humanity, as human who awakens after nuclear apocalypse to find herself in this vessel or vehicle with the Onkali, a species who are genetically merging themselves with humanity in order, and it is the only way in which the planet Earth can be saved. In these books, Dawn, Adulthood Rights, and Imago, one finds a series of prescient and persistent struggles. And over the course of rereading the work, I found myself both captivated by the imaginative universe of the novels. They're brilliant, they're provocative, but also thinking about core concepts like free will, like liberty and liberation, like the question of captivity, like the question of consent, that are concepts that have both shaped and confounded the American project and modernity itself. So when you read them, you feel all of those questions, and you also feel the workings of gender. You feel the burdens of that Lilith experiences quite intimately, the confusion, the frustrations, the resentments of her and her descendants and the people around her. The experience of when certain hopes feel foreclosed, the reality of terror when the world changes. And all of it, I think, is a wonderful reminder that good speculative fiction always has that duality of both expanding our imaginations and helping us recognize our world and our own lives more clearly. Our work has certainly impacted my own creative work. It encourages me to reach farther and deeper into my own imagination, even as the work I write deals with, what are deemed social facts. In the work, I speculate about the future and how we might reach for its beauty in the face of terror. It is indeed an honor to introduce this or reintroduce these works to the world. And I just want to conclude by saying I encourage you to read these books, to also read Susanna Morris's new biography of Octavia Butler, Adrienne Marie Brown's Emergent Strategy, and of course, the work of the broader community of Black writers of speculative fiction, like Stephen Barnes and Nalo Hopkinson, and of course, the brilliant Tananarive Due, of whom I am also a fan, who is an iconic genre-defying and expanding and absolutely brilliant writer. And we have her here, and we're going to be in conversation, but I want to invite her on to offer some comments about her relationship to Octavia Butler.
Thank you so much for that. That was a beautiful presentation. I too feel the energy. I hope the workmen at my house are not too loud. Of course, they're here now. Um, I do teach Octavia Butler at UCLA. I've taught Dawn actually in my Afrofuturism class at UCLA. But I want to talk a bit more about Octavia from a personal level, at least to start, because I first met her. I knew her. I was blessed to know her. And I first met her at a conference at Clark Atlanta University in 1997 called the African American Fantastic Imagination: Explorations in Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Horror. Her mentor, Samuel R. Delany, was there. So was my now husband, Stephen Barnes. I'm even told that Samuel Delany and Octavia were kind of giggling together as they watched the sparks flying between me and Steve, because we did end up getting married pretty much almost just a year later. My biggest regret with Octavia is that I did not know her better or pick up the phone more. I know people who have gone through her papers at the archives at the Huntington here in Southern California, and one researcher reported something back to me that was like a punch to my stomach. She said, Octavia said, Tananarive won't talk to me. And I'm like, no. This is a cautionary tale. I was very nervous. People say Octavia was nervous. Well, guess what? Meeting her in 1997 on the basis of just really then my first novel was out. The Between. I was very nervous about talking to her. I had her email address, which was Butler8 star, STAR, was her email address. So I think that Destiny in the Stars really meant something to her that she talked about in Parable. But I also had her telephone number, and I just would not use them. I almost never did. One of the last times she reached out to me was to ask me to blurb Fledgling, but anytime we spoke, it was pretty much business or an appearance or never, hey girl, how you doing? Which even as I say that now, knowing what I know now, I would have so much trouble making that call even today. But I do, now I know that's what I should have done. And we could have been more friends, like my husband, Stephen Barnes, who knew her for 20 years and invited her over for dinner and drove her places. If it ever crossed my mind, hey, I should call Octavia, there was another voice saying, don't bother her. Maybe she's writing. And I should not have listened to that voice. So in the year 2000, Steve and I interviewed Octavia for American Visions magazine, and I still have at least a part of that recording from that day, which I will share with you all here. But before we play the excerpt, I'll tell you what I remember from that day. Music was blasting from inside of her house, playing so loudly that we could hear it out on the front porch. I want to say it was Motown, but I'd be lying if I said I remember for sure. I do remember that when she opened her door, she apologized and she said that she listened to music when she writes. And I was like, me too. But again, I probably did not say that out loud. She was a vegetarian, maybe even vegan. So she served us lentil soup, very tasty bread. And then we got to this interview, which really felt more like just a conversation between friends, those friends being Steve and Octavia, with me just feeling lucky to be there. And we talked about her career, writing advice, teaching experiences. But then we got to a core question about central themes in her work, to return to the academic for a bit. The question of whether or not she considered herself, because of the unflinching nature of her work, whether she considered herself a pessimist. And this was Octavia's response. Please play the recording.
Readers have often commented on what seems to be a bleakness of vision, an underlying threat of pessimism in much of your work. How would you address that?
Oh, goodness. Well, hey, I mean, look at us. Look at us. Look what we keep doing. We keep marching to the brink and then drawing back. And the horrible thing is there are some things you can't draw back. I mean, even now, okay, the Russian ship goes up to the Arctic and says, gee, there's no ice here, you know, where we would expect to find ice. And I listened to several programs in which people said, well, maybe it's natural. Or, well, this happens occasionally, and nobody says global warming. You know, except maybe the reporter who's asking questions.
Is this global warming? Because that's the first thing I thought of.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I didn't think of global warming because there was at the North Pole there was not that much ice. I thought of global warming because of the whole family of stuff that's been happening.
Right.
And it's not a matter of, oh, global warming will kill us, because it won't. But it'll kill a lot of people. And it already is killing a lot of people in Africa. But I mean, we've got so many indicators, and people find them inconvenient, so they look at each one separately and say, well, you can't prove anything by this, and you know, we just don't seem to be. Well, we're not really that long term. We're longer term than I guess any other animal species as far as thinking goes, but we're not long term enough for our technology. It seems like what our technology is doing is helping us to do what every other species does, which is basically turning as much of the Earth into ourselves as we can before we crash.
Whew. That is hard to listen to. Not the laughter. I love the laughter, but that ending. Look at us. Look at us. Look at us, she said. And honestly, 2025 feels so much worse in many ways than the 2000, at least in terms of projected trajectory. It just became very clear to me that day that Octavia's mission, not just as an author, but it would seem in life, was literally to try to save humanity. As she put it in another portion of the interview, one of the ways she tried to do that was with Dawn and the Xenogenesis series. Maybe the aliens can save us. She tried again with Parable of the Sower, even though she herself had fallen away from organized religion. Maybe a new religion can save us. These weren't literal suggestions, especially in terms of Dawn, but thought exercises designed to break readers out of our apathy and lethargy and hierarchical thinking and say, we can't continue on this path. We must change. And unfortunately, that's still where we are, perhaps in many ways more than ever. But luckily for us, as Octavia herself reminded us with her Earthseed passages, the only lasting truth is change. And with that, I would love to begin our discussion.
So beautiful. Yeah, and it's such, I mean, you capture her in such beautiful, with such beautiful clarity. I love hearing her voice. Um, and right, we're still asking the same questions. Um, and I feel like I'm still trying to listen to her say, "Look at us, right? Look at us." And that and still feel responsible to respond to that call. How do we save humanity? So and you described the Oankali in some ways as a thought exercise, which I also love, because I wonder if you have a feeling of I don't know how we might, or how do you, because I think there's multiple interpretations, read them, right? As
Oh,
saviors, as abductors, as,
let's talk about it.
right? With these,
It's
yeah.
nothing's ever easy with Octavia, by the way. Nothing is easy. There, even though in her own words, she created this scenario as sort of an off-ramp for us, an exit. Like, this is how we can save humanity. She doesn't present us with aliens that I think are that easy to like, really, frankly. I mean, and I think Octavia is really the master of these gray areas,
Mm,
right? Whether it's kindred, the gray areas around would you have done? Because that's not what and the gray areas in fledgling, which is so difficult because of the sexuality and also in Dawn. And this series, there's a lot of very uncomfortable sexuality and non-consent and all kinds of things. So it's hard to sort of throw open our arms and
mm,
say these are our saviors, right? But at the same time, literally, that is what they are meant to represent. So, as always, Octavia tasks us with having to think. There's no such thing as swallowing the whole premise without sort of backing up against some aspects of it that are personally problematic, ethically problematic, and as much as the Oankali kind of have nothing kind to say about the human race, and sort of the whole tenor of the series isn't that kind toward the human race. One of their biggest complaints is that we are so hierarchical.
yes.
Well, I have news for them. They are holding her in a cell against her will. They decide when she gets paper and pen or whatever so she can write. All these decisions are being thrust upon her because they are superior. I mean, they don't say those words, but that's exactly how they behave. So, who is really upholding hierarchy?
Right. No, I think absolutely. And I mean, in some ways, for me, it raises the question of if we're going to save humanity, aren't we going to have to be very uncomfortable, right? Given what the world as it's been made, to course correct in any way is going to require a great deal of sacrifice and discomfort and decision making that doesn't feel clear, particularly around choice,
Yes.
how we live our lives. And so it's almost, and then it's at the very these sort of, I mean, as you said, these sort of the terrain of sexuality makes it even more difficult, and reproduction makes it even more difficult, right? And it's one of the ways that I think she has these extended engagements with gender in expansive ways, not just sort of introducing the reality that there, or introducing concepts of more than two genders, but also the violence that is associated both historically and presently around sexuality and reproduction. Yeah. And then there's this other question about hybridity, right? And being more than one thing, or fitting in more than one category. Do you have thoughts about?
Well, I love hybridity, just as a concept, because that's where you get innovation. That's where you get growth. That's where cultures flourish when they exchange information and they build on what the other tribe is doing and that sort of thing. So that is a part of the adaptation process that Octavia writes about, again, in Parable Adapt or Die. We
Yeah,
we we are not, there's no isolation. There's no such thing as isolation. We can try, but there's no true sense of isolation. So since that isn't a true possibility. Why not learn to thrive with hybridity, but hopefully consensual, that's where we sort of run up against the wall with the Oankali. I mean, it makes a lot of sense from the point of view of the Oankali that they have to blend their genetics in order to survive. That is their literal model for survival. Whereas with humans, I mean, one might argue, as Octavia just said, that we may not be that long lived. That's painful to hear. But if you have enough of us, we don't have to blend with another species to procreate. We could, humans are fine without being forced to literally exchange genetic material with another species, whereas the Oankali need us in that way. And it's a bit an uneven bargain, but I love what you said about how it's uncomfortable. And if you don't mind, I'd like to shift to a question of leadership because of the splendor of having a Black woman at the center of this story. And some of you may not remember those old paperbacks of Dawn where they had a white woman on the cover for Lilith. Those are, you can Google Dawn and look at the covers and tell me I'm lying. So that was what she had to deal with in terms of just in the industry, and that's a whole different conversation. But one of the things that is so fascinating about Octavia and really in Dawn, which is where I'll focus a lot of my remarks, is that the leadership model she presents is also very uncomfortable. There are no comfortable leaders. These Black women who are leading in Octavia's novels, there's nothing comfortable about their role. Dana's not comfortable in Kindred, obviously. Lauren isn't comfortable in Parable. It's more and more discomfort as the series goes, which having known people who are leaders and have been leaders, my late mother, pictured on the wall behind me in a march, was a civil rights activist. There was nothing comfortable, but the reason she's wearing those dark glasses is because she was tear gassed, and she wore dark glasses most of her life after that because of sensitivity to light. So the truth of this, I think, is part of what resonates in Octavia's work, is that there are so many traps to
Mm.
being a leader. The trap of mistrust among the people you're supposed to be leading, having to constantly prove yourself again and again, trying to keep harmony between disparate opinions. It may not even be that different, but people get it like, if anyone's been in an organization, you know what I'm talking about. Leadership is so hard. But I think this is probably the most important takeaway I get from a lot of Octavia's work is like my mother used to say, ordinary people do extraordinary things. And she writes these protagonists who are ordinary people who are forced, despite their discomfort, to lead.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And there is something, what you just said captures this duality, right? There's something extraordinary about telling stories with Black women as leaders and casting Black women in the center of these stories, and also not turning them into romances, but actually dealing with the reality of the difficulty of leadership. And so there are these, imagined circumstances, but there's a deep truth about all of those pressures and dangers, and also being cast into the position of leadership unwittingly,
Yes.
right? And in certainly in this case without being not without initially consenting to it. But I want to go back. You raised this point, which I think is really interesting, that the Oankali need humanity, and I want to say need us, because you get so captivated in the novels, it's like it's real, even though it's not.
Right.
Need us, but humans have been so destructive, but that this is the only way humanity can survive. They're told, right? And so there's a sort of belief, and I wonder if, in a sense, that's where the warning lies, is that, if we don't get ourselves together, that we won't have a choice as to what will be. And that feels partially like where we are right now, you know.
Yeah, it's, I hate to follow, such insightful analysis with such a playful response. But, from time to time you see social media posts about UFOs, the aliens are coming, and so many of us are like, please just come, it can't be worse, right? Like, but the fact of the matter is it can be worse.
It can always be worse.
It can always be worse. So, but the fact that we feel that way, the other human trait is to want to follow. You know what I mean? Like just leadership, fall in line, and because we are so used to that hierarchy. So if we are not leading, then by definition, then we're following, right? So so yeah, it's prickly, and we are absolutely not just reaching the point, but at the point where there are things we don't have a choice about. I wish I could think of big examples. There are very small examples in our daily lives of how we've had to accommodate to the times that we're living in. Even my parents, because of civil rights involvement, never wanted to say things over the phone because they might be tapped by the FBI, and now it's because we don't have privacy. So I may have an Alexa because I look in on my dad, who's 91, to help my sister out, but I unplug that thing the minute I'm done because I don't trust having it in my house. And Octavia wasn't even talking about this kind of technology
But
back in 2000. I mean, she would be horrified at what we're dealing with in 2025.
did you experience her? I mean, it's interesting because that interview you began with this question of pessimism, but it was wonderful to hear her voice because with the moi, right? There's
It
just
doesn't sound pessimistic.
a playfulness and even and a joyfulness, and you get that sense through her journals as well. And I just wanted to ask you about that, right? The sort of unflinching look at every possible kind of horrific reality future, and also a sense of play and humor, because there's humor all through her work.
I think, that is one thing that I really enjoyed the most from that interview. And in many ways, I did feel like I was just watching Steve and Octavia enjoying their time together. There was like a kind of almost girlishness to her in the way she would joke and laugh and respond. And I'm glad you all got to hear that. And it is really quite the arc in just a short interview to go from that laughter and joy to her proclamation at the end that we aren't going to make it.
Yeah.
We are, I got news for y'all. We are not. I mean, it's so many words. And I'm glad that she had that balance within her. Because yes, was Octavia shy? Yes, she was shy and probably did not like being touched. And there were, there were maybe some walls she had around her. Harlan Ellison, one of her first mentors, said that when he first met her, she was covering up her mouth out of shyness when she talked to people. And she blossomed from that into an experienced public speaker who did a great deal of traveling and interacting with people. She found her way. And I think that considering how much she had time to really sit and marinate in current events in a way a lot of us don't, in the sense that she never married and raised a family. She lived alone after her mother passed away and she had moved up to Seattle. So she spent a lot of time by herself and watching, not watching probably, but reading news, listening to news, worrying about what is. She was looking straight at the thing in a way a lot of us, maybe we just glance it from time to time out of the corner of our eye, but we have distraction in a way she did not. And I'm really glad that she found those tools, whether it was the loud music, her friends, her actual friends who weren't afraid to call her. I'm glad she had those outlets so that she could continue to channel her love for us into the work without being burned up by it.
I also love that you shared that your own hesitation, because that's part of, we have these people in our lives who are these iconic figures, or about whom we just shy about, and they are human. And in fact, it's part of the inspiration is they're ordinary people who do absolutely extraordinary things. I actually don't teach the Xenogenesis series. I've taught fledgling most of all of her work, in part because it's a courtroom procedural and I have a legal.
Mm.
But do you, well, one, I want to ask, do you have a favorite? Um, and where do you think of this series sort of sitting in the body of her work? Because as you said before, she's looking at every possible way to get us to
Yeah.
save ourselves.
It's it's so hard to use the word favorite because it's so traumatic. But I think, for new readers, I very often will suggest Kindred because I consider that accessible. My personal is probably Parable of the Sower, although it is a very uncomfortable novel. It is, I mean, she mission accomplished in terms of creating, I won't call it a religion, but a system that can give people real emotional sustenance when they need it. Like mission accomplished. Once I sat next to one of Octavia's childhood friends at an opera, the Toshi Reagan opera, Parable of the Sower, and her childhood friend was sitting next to me, and she said, when she started showing me those Earthseed passages, I said, "Hey, now I'm the poet." But she touches, I mean, it's because she really does touch, like I know, and I can speak to it personally, because after the 2016 election, when I was like sitting dazed in my house and I couldn't make sense of what had just happened, literally could not make sense of it, the parable, the only lasting truth is change, broke me out of my stupor. Like, oh, like it gave me clarity. It gave me a way to process. And I think as difficult as that novel is with its violence, and again, it's just so unflinching, the beauty in it supersedes everything.
Yes, beautiful, beautifully stated. You all should be getting your questions ready. Do we have questions already? Because I think we can turn to some of them.
We do have some. Uh, Thank you very much for that. It was really great, fascinating. Um, it's interesting. A lot of the questions have to do with influences on Butler, and I think that on her writing, and I think that where that's coming from is people's sense of the astonishing originality of her work, and like this sense people have that it kind of this amazingly full form thing came out of nowhere. So I just wanted to call out a couple of them. Charles Sperling from Queens, New York says, "Did Butler ever make any comments on Ray Bradbury's work?" I think he calls out Other Foot and Way in the Middle of the Air, work which thematizes race. But there are Christina Hawk from Lawrence, Kansas says, "Can you talk about Butler's literary genealogy?" Um, Pat McPherson of Westchester, Pennsylvania says, "What and who were her main influences?" Um, Steve Smith of Avondale, Pennsylvania asks, what were some of her main influences both in and out of the science fiction genre? Um, and then there are some other more particular questions. Carlos Labe Jorquera of Brooklyn wants to know if we know what she was reading at the time of writing Xenogenesis. And Harriet Rubin of Portland, Oregon is asking, was she influenced by Mary Shelley's Frankenstein? So there are just a whole
Wow.
bunch of people want to know, like, do we know who influenced her, who her mentors were as a writer, and what she may have been absorbing at the time she was at work on Xenogenesis?
Those are great questions. And I all I know is she had a lot of books on her bookshelf when we were at her house. I can only speak to mentors, which would have been Harlan Ellison, and also Samuel R. Delany was her first teacher at Clarion.
Which is I mean, that is extraordinary too. I mean, just I mean, but this is not an answer to that question, but I wonder if I could sort of pivot the question a little bit and ask about this world of Black writers of speculative fiction that is a longer genealogy than most people know, but is both extraordinary, but also has, right, it's a terrain that has been hard fought for. Is that fair to say?
Oh my goodness, yes. I can't even imagine what it was like to be Samuel R. Delany in the 1960s. out there virtually alone. Octavia coming up. And Steve had some very lonely times, my husband. When we were at her house, there's a photograph that was from Clark Atlanta that was with me, Steve, Samuel Delaney, Jewel Gomez, and Octavia, and she had it on her wall. And what she said was, "My other family," which I'm so glad she felt that sense of community. I mean, toward the end of her life, there were a lot of programs called Black to the Future. And there was one in Seattle. There might have been one in other cities. And it was like a traveling road show in a way that must not have been the case. And I think the Clark Atlanta gathering was the first of its kind in terms of Afrofuturism, like specifically about Black speculative arts. I don't think there had been one previous to that. So she saw that family emerge around her, and she was very, very supportive of young writers and was very happy to see the field expanding. That I know.
You began to answer this question, but there's another bunch of questions about where to start with Octavia Butler. Shafiq Kadri from North York, Ontario says, what book should I start reading her with? L.J. Anderson of Jefferson, Georgia says, for a high school student who has never read any of Butler's work, where's a good place to start? And then Kip Dawson of Pittsburgh says, I work primarily with inner city high school kids. Which of Butler's novels or other work would you recommend as an entree for them? So 3 kind of approaches to the same question, really. Same kind of question.
Do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I honestly am tempted. I think what you said about Kindred is absolutely true. That you don't have to be familiar with the genres to in order to enter with that novel. But I also kind of feel like she was so expansive in term, there's the, the sort of vampire stories, there's the science fiction, there's the speculative fiction, there's the biological themes, there's the apocalyptic. And so I almost feel like people should actually look at the body of work and see what excites their imagination and allow that to be their entry point. Because once you're in it, if it's this, you're like, oh, this is the kind of story I like. Once you're in it, I feel like her work becomes addictive, right? You want to see what the other things that she's going to do, what's coming next. Yeah.
And there is so much, and you're right, they're so different. And also the short stories, Blood Child and Other Stories, maybe that's a good access point because they reflect a lot of the common themes in her work, and they're shorter. But it's so interesting when you talk about high school students because I think about the difficult aspects of like every single one of the books. Well, let me think. Yeah, they're pretty violent, and there's unusual sexuality in a lot of the books, for lack of a better term. So that's something to bear in mind for younger kids. I was telling an anecdote about an exhibition at the Huntington where they had invited a lot of people from the community to come, where her papers are housed, and they had drawings on the wall from a third grade class, and the drawings were from Dawn, and I was like. And they said, no, they didn't read it. We just told them excerpts from the story, which jumps to a question that is related, and pardon me for jumping out of order, like how do my students feel about it? To be honest, I did stop teaching fledgling for a while because some of my students were bumping up against a protagonist who presents as an 11 or 12-year-old who's very sexual and uses sexual addiction as a way of building her family. And even in that Octavia Butler conference, I asked a room full of scholars, if she'd ever addressed this question or how do you handle this when you're teaching it? And nobody really knew what to say, except going back to that point of how she really wants us to be uncomfortable sometimes.
And it feels, the discomfort also feels to me a way to be serious about the things that we engage in often very flippant ways in our society, right? Because any teenager today is actually encountering all of these subjects, but often doesn't deal with the discomfort, right? That just sort of treats, whether it's music or film or television. And so it actually, I think the novels force us to sit with things that we take in passively so frequently. And so, and I think you're absolutely right, which also means that when you're teaching this work, you have to be extreme, whether it's college students and certainly with high school students, you have to be extremely careful.
Yes.
Teaching should be um, in general.
Yeah, just to follow up, I mean, on two things you're talking about, kindred on the one hand and kind of this discomfort on the other. Um, Robin Pays from Germantown, Maryland says, I'm a big fan of Kindred. I love that she puts us in the place of an enslaved person from another century. How do the two of you see fiction as a way to evoke radical empathy? And I guess I would expand that question because, yeah, the empathy is one side of it, but of course, as we've been saying for an hour now, almost, the other side of it is revulsion, really. And in some ways, the fiction moves between those two poles or something like that. I mean, and so I guess, how do you think about that? How do you think about the idea of empathy and, trying to understand beings of another species or of another whatever gender, and the strong revulsion that there is towards some of these creatures, the tentacles and all that stuff, like what's going on there? How do you read that?
I think that part of what I think is so brilliant about her work is that it can't be used as instruction in any kind of simple way, right? This is not, so sometimes we look to work to teach us how to be empathetic or to teach us how to be decent. It's not that. Instead, I think it actually engages all of the emotions because sometimes you read the characters who enrage you, who frustrate you, who you might identify with, and you're like, well, why are you doing that? Or you see that there's something that's not functional, and that I think is part of the reason the books stay with me, at least, is that there isn't a simple, and Tananarive said this earlier, there's not a simple answer, and there's certainly not a simple lesson. These are not, fairy tales or that have an instructive component. They're instead grappling with the hardest parts of being human.
Very well put. And in the case of Kindred especially, I think that that discomfort is part of what makes that book so important. Because unlike Dawn, unlike Fledgling, which are more theoretical and sort of allegories, slavery actually happened. And we are still living in the aftermath of slavery. And we are living in times that are trying desperately to erase the very horrors that she's writing about in Kindred. So you not only get the radical empathy, but you get the actual history. She did a lot of research when she wrote this book. So you get the actual history and also that piece where now I can maybe understand whether you're black or white or whatever race or ethnicity. Now I have a better idea of what it might have felt like to be enslaved, which is a big thing. That's not a small thing. And then on top of that, but I would have done this instead of that. Or I'm not comfortable with this decision or that decision, but you're in it and you're living it as opposed to pretending it never happened.
Good. Yeah. There's a couple of ways to go here. So, you're talking about the ways that, horror and terror and revulsion and empathy and all these things are ways of talking about the things that matter the most to all of us. And that kind of gets us also into and someone you used the word fairy tale. And there are a number of questions about Butler's interest in or use of myth and religion. And I just wanted to ask if you have any thoughts about that. The one question, so I find it here. Well, there's the question of Lilith, which you brought up. Another viewer, Seth Gators from Raleigh, says, "Could you explore the religious dimensions of her work?" So, and there's Parable of the Sower, and another questioner is asking, are there biblical references? So, I don't know if you have anything you would like to say about the influence on her or her use of, or the ways that she incorporates, either, biblical or mythic or fairy tale elements as part of her vision. And then, is there a religious dimension is something that people are asking to the work.
Well, this is another one that's so interestingly two-sided because on the one hand, as I mentioned earlier, Octavia herself had fallen away from organized religion. And yet, when she wrote Parable of the Sower, she intentionally wanted to draw upon the power of a shared belief system, which I will call a religion, to create change, to create society, even. Like Lauren is trying to create a new society. So on the one hand, she's rejecting those aspects of organized religion that did not work for her personally, while at the same time trying to evoke and preserve those aspects that she thinks can be very powerful when they're used well, is my interpretation of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, and it seems to me, in addition to that, there's that often myth and religion are these seeds that she puts in the novels that then become extended engagements with the questions that religions ask, which are the questions that humanity asks, right? So that it doesn't require a kind of fidelity to a particular religion. I mean, part of the reason Earthseed, I think, is so compelling is both that it has as much a sense of philosophy as religion in a moment when everything seems to have fallen apart, right? Which feels also, which is why it feels so prescient.
Yeah. Okay, let's just ask you about a different kind of difficulty now. There's a question from Sonia Daniels Mole from Beulah, Michigan, who says, I've loved Butler's work for a long time, and earlier this year, I learned she was dyslexic like me. And it reassured me so much, knowing that even though letters and words can be a struggle, my writing voice is valid and I need to keep writing. How do you think this challenge affected her imagination, or her writing process, or her perspective in her storytelling?
This is just me looking from the outside in. We never had a conversation about this, but the impression I got from Octavia was that her writing process was a struggle. And there were many reasons for this. Dyslexia was one, and also medications that she took, I think, for depression. I think that's public knowledge, made it difficult to write. So I've often told people that if I had as little fun writing as Octavia seemed to have, I would not have been a writer because it really did feel like she had to fight for those sentences. She, I think, considered herself a slow writer and a slow reader, but yet she did those things. So it was again that message of persistence and just one foot in front of the other, and you just keep on the path, which was the way she lived her life.
I think there's something about this and her life, and it actually there's something similar about Lorraine Hansberry, who struggled in school and got a D in theater right before becoming one of the most important playwrights in American history. So they think there's something critical about what we miss in the way we evaluate people's capacities and the particular insights that can come from difference or disability that we so often pathologize in our society, when in fact those can be the points of deepest recognition of what actually is happening in our world. So this is not also certainly not from any kind of personal knowledge, but it just strikes me as yet another example of why it's so important to sort of let go of the way we categorize people in terms of their skill levels based upon kinds of abilities, right?
Thank you for that. Okay, so we have time for one more question. I'm going to do another one of these kind of bundled things. This comes under the rubric of why now. We seem to be going through a kind of a long Octavia Butler moment. May it wave. But we had the FX Kindred, which Brandon Jacobs Jenkins did, and there's a lot of movies and other TV shows that are in development, various places, and you hear Octavia Butler's name a lot, it seems like. And so there's some other questions that relate to that, really, which is to say, why Octavia Butler and why now? And Sandra Gonzalez asks, how does Butler's Afrofuturism speak to our current shape-shifting social reality? And Lilia Brinkley from Cherry Hill, New Jersey, my hometown, says, how do we use the lessons from Octavia's writings to thrive during this time? And I guess, in general, what people are asking is, okay, we're having this, this program, what is it about Octavia Butler's work and her vision that we can take away with us right now, that can help us right now? Like, why is she speaking to us now, and why should she speak to us now?
I can hear her in that interview. Look at us. Look at us. I mean, it's not a coincidence. I think it was her first New York Times best-selling, or the first time she was on the New York Times bestseller list was during COVID, I believe, for Parable of the Sower. So a lot of people discovered why now, when they felt that society was falling apart. You can't get toilet paper. You don't know if you're going to die because you have a cough. It was the scariest time a lot of people had ever lived through. And that book in particular is almost a manual, even down to, oh wait, you can make almond bread or not almond bread, what is it? Acorn, acorn bread. Um, Her work reads like a manual, even if it's less literal, because it is so real and true. And like all good Afrofuturism is about the past, present, and future simultaneously. So there's a timelessness in her work as well.
I love that formulation. And I always think about the Ida B. Wells quote, the people must know before they can act. And I think part of knowing is this kind of deep thinking that she impresses upon us. And so, we feel a sense of urgency, but there's a lot of contemplation that we need to do in order to move forward.
Thank you so much. You've been listening to Tananarive Due and Imani Perry discuss Octavia Butler's visionary Xenogenesis Trilogy, just published in the Library of America, number 393 in the series, edited by Professor Perry. I hope you'll join us for forthcoming online events from Library of America on Tuesday, December 2nd. It's Helen Vendler's Sixth Sense, an exploration of the great critic's final essays on her touchstone poets and poems, just published by Library of America in the volume Inhabit the Poem. Join Stephanie Burt, Dan Kiasen, and other distinguished poets and poetry scholars for a conversation about Vendler's empathetic approach to reading poems and her brilliant critical legacy. And then on Wednesday, December 17th, LOA Live welcomes playwright Bess Wohl, whose acclaimed play Liberation is at Broadway's James Earl Jones Theater through January, for a conversation with memoirist Honor Moore, co-editor of the LOA collection Women's Liberation, Feminist Writings that Inspired a Revolution and Still Can. Details about these and other upcoming LOA Live events can be found on our website, loa.org, where you'll also find information about Library of America's Octavia Butler edition and Helen Vendler and Women's Liberation collections, with links to purchase those and other editions of Great American Writing. You'll also find recordings of tonight's and previous LOA Live events. Thanks so much again for coming. Warm thanks again to Imani Perry and Tananarive Due for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
And
That was great.
I hope everyone has a great evening. Thank you.